I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. The successful demonstration of work from home during the pandemic has caused more than a little panic among cities and city leaders. Mayor Muriel Bowser in Washington, D.C. told President Biden to bring federal workers back to their offices. And D.C. has developed a comeback plan to grow in population and jobs. In this episode, I talk with Nicholas Ramphos of the Metropolitan Washington Transportation Planning Board about a regional ridership survey assessing changes in commuting, and to Jordan Rappaport of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City about his paper which predicts a housing boom in ex-urban locations as workers cut their commute by working from home. Carbon footprint discussions did not make the paper, but they are included in this conversation. If you care about public transportation and housing, you will want to listen. Usual disclaimer: my guest views are theirs alone and not of their employers.
I've never lived a single day in a world without mass school shootings. With Columbine in 99, you'd think by now I'd be desensitized. Sandy Hook when I was in 7th grade. How naive was I to believe things would change? They never change. 'Cause that's the America we live in. That's the America we grew up in, don't you know? That's the America we fight for even.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society moving precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from Rockville singer-songwriter Gabriel Zvi. Gabriel graduated from MCPS in 2018 and now serves as a commissioner on Rockville City Human Rights Commission and the Montgomery County Committee Against Hate Violence.
That's the America we fight for, even though they fight back at us as they trample life, bringing their guns to a playground fight. And my friends, they never hear the end of it, and I fear we'll never put an end to this. How many lives of children will be lost to it? How many times? How many times?
You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. 3 days into his governorship, Wes Moore submitted a new state budget intended to end child poverty and building a world-class education system, among other matters. The budget allocates $475 million extra toward the education of low-income students and puts another $500 million from the state's budget surplus toward the Blueprint for Maryland's Future Fund, the big education legislation that is intended to alter public education in the state. Education performance is notoriously hard to measure. They stubbornly track with family wealth rather than school spending. After starting out as an instrument to ensure Black and brown students are not left behind, standardized tests have done quite the reverse. created permanently lagging schools and permanently leading schools, redistributed teachers from low-score schools to high-score schools, and still leaves behind those who were being left behind earlier. Instead, we often tend to use input variables to substitute for output variables in education. The blueprint legislation is believed to have leveraged the extra monies to bring about changes in 5 areas of education policy and practice: early childhood education, high quality and diverse teachers, college and career readiness, targeting students with particular needs, and governance and accountability. It is worth taking stock of these 5 pillars as they stand today. First, on early childhood education, we have run up against a big issue. The blueprint's plan with respect to this item was designed to include private providers in a statewide and state-certified, if not a state-managed network. But private providers have generally refused to join the state's network because the payments are low and the requirements high. The providers I talk to say they have wait lists for their services and do not want to get involved with the state and meet its requirements. Second, on high quality and diverse teachers. This has been a long-standing aspiration in public education, but there doesn't seem to be a clear pathway ahead. Right now, when we have a national teacher shortage, when teaching as a profession has taken a beating, how do we get a minority young person to choose a career in education and replicate those rare yes decisions to scale? In MCPS, Latino teachers are probably the worst represented, followed by Asian Americans and then African Americans. Getting those specific groups into a field which is underpaid and often treated as a second salary for households is not an easy hurdle to overcome. Third, college and career readiness. In MCPS schools, I have seen woodworking machines pushed to the wall to make room for banks of computers where students play on some software. Agriculture and horticulture used to be a thing in the school system. Now, maybe 2 MCPS high schools have them. MCPS has 2 schools with broad vocational programming, but the only system-wide vocational program is early childhood education. Fourth, more resources for students with particular needs. This applies to special education students and to English language learners, as well as students from low-income families. As a general matter of political philosophy, governments have struggled mightily to target special groups effectively with public resources. Often, the service delivery system becomes so expensive that the final delivery of service becomes insignificant. Not surprisingly, universal programs such as Social Security tend to be better supported politically than targeted programs for special groups. Lastly, on governance and accountability. At the local level, the blueprint legislation requires school councils, but MCPS, for example, has largely rejected the idea. Further, gun and school violence have led schools to lock down and become fortress-like. Balancing this fortress mentality with community engagement is going to be one heck of a challenge. Governor Moore also announced that the state government had a 13.4% vacancy rate in state government positions, the highest in a decade, coming on top of a national labor shortage, most dramatically in the public sector. This is yet another challenge he will need to face squarely. Lastly, he announced that he did not expect state budget surpluses to last even into next year, 2024, let alone through 2028 as predicted by the Department of Legislative Services and the Board of Revenue in their estimates earlier. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. I'll be back with Nick Ramphus of the Transportation Planning Board.
We are people, helping people, not just the leaders of tomorrow. We are the leaders of today, advocating for the changes in this world, well aware of what is right, a message in the words we say. Sometimes we stop and think, why are we doing what we do? Maybe we just need a new and different point of view. It's like we don't even see the change, microscopic day by day. Take the chance and turn away, step back and look at the world, see the difference that you made. So let's lead the way, start a worldwide relay, where reactions interchange. Speak out, let your voice be heard, tell them what you got to say. We are people, no we're more than people. We are part of something stronger, something bigger.
Nicholas Ramphus, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Hey, Sunil. Thank you for having me.
Can we start with the top numbers from the State of the Commute survey that the Transportation Planning Board conducts every 3 years?
Now, keep in mind, we're only talking about commute travel, okay, not all travel. And when we did the survey in 2022, telework's share of weekly commute trips was about at 48%, which is nearly 5 times what it was in 2019, which it was at 10%.
Mm-hmm.
The use of other modes declined. So drive alone went from 58 to 41%. Transit went from 24 to 8%. And then there were smaller drops for ride sharing and bike and walk. However, when you take telework out of the mix, driving alone actually increased as a share of the trips made to outside work locations. And there was also a dramatic drop in transit trips.
The metro in particular was having difficulty even before the pandemic. But now it seems that the bottom's fallen out.
It's close to 70% of them said they didn't use transit because of the pandemic. Service availability was also a factor for some because their home or work location had changed. And we did see a lot of people changing their home locations during the pandemic. And then about a third of the reasons had to do with service attributes. So it could have been limited service schedules because, there was a lot of service cutbacks, or the service taking way too much time, which really directly does reflect on Metro taking some of the 7,000 series rail cars out of service. And then also unreliability, whether it was a missed bus not showing up or, the frequency of the trains. Even with commuter rail, we saw a lot of this happen. And so then we asked folks on top of this, how satisfied are you with your commute? And when we looked at that, the bicyclists and the walkers were the most satisfied. Metro rail and bus riders were the least satisfied. And I think a lot of that probably had to do with, these particular factors. So when you look at, the satisfaction rate, let's just take Metro rail, for instance. In 2019, it was at 56%. In 2022, it dropped 10 percentage points to 46%. I mean, that's pretty dramatic. And the bus was even more of a drop from 62% to 44%. Now, interestingly enough, satisfaction levels for people who were driving alone went up from 45% to 51%. And probably some of that had to do with, I would say, maybe quicker commute times because there wasn't maybe as much traffic as what we had seen, pre-pandemic. We also have done some qualitative surveys recently. Found from those were that, people essentially were telling us the same thing, that, they don't want to get on transit. They don't know anyone. They don't know anyone to carpool with. They're not really sure about van pooling. And also it's all about time and money and saving, as much money as possible on your commute, as well as how much time it's going to take.
What about BRT? Is that separated out at all?
No, and honestly, it probably wouldn't even show up.
Because it's so small?
Yes, very tiny. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any breakdowns by jurisdictions?
That will be available probably early next year. And so that.
Do you have any top line from there?
Not yet.
Okay.
Because the data just came out, so we're still looking through it, and we have a lot of data. We interviewed about 8,400 workers in the area, so it's a pretty big data set, and it's just going to take a while to sift through it and put the data sets together.
Do you at least have the jurisdictional breakdown of the N of 8,400?
I think there were probably about 10 to 11 jurisdictions that are in this survey. So the smallest count was around 511. The largest was around 970.
Were there any other surprising takeaways from the survey?
We also saw a higher percentage of home location changes. And then there was also a lower awareness of commuting and information resources, both at a regional scale as well as at an employment scale. We reach out to employers to essentially get them to beef up their commuter benefits programs. But because of the pandemic and a lot of them pausing people coming into the office, and then maybe, workers not really paying attention to their commute, there was just a much lower awareness of what those options are. So we have some build back to do in terms of, getting that information out there, particularly now that offices are reopening and people are coming back in.
Let's talk about solutions. So you did mention education. Are there other things that you would suggest that you are thinking about and going to propose within the Council of Governments? We
do provide free ride matching services. So in the algorithm where we provide these services, typically in the past, what we told folks is you have an origin and destination. So you can do a search radius, from a mile all the way up to, maybe 10 miles from your home location and your work location. Or you could do a search along the corridor that you take to and from work. But the one thing that we didn't have was, well, what if you just want to match with just your coworkers and not anybody else? Because one of the things that we saw in carpool formation was that the pandemic caused a major change in that over 3/4 of the respondents said, yeah, the ones that were carpooling said that, yeah, I just carpool with family members, people that I know. And that's a 20% increase on what we saw in 2019. And then we saw a huge drop in slugging, which is, it went down to, from 20% down to 4%. So essentially folks saying, I don't want to ride with strangers, or people I don't know. So one of the messages that we're getting out there is that, essentially carpool with your circle of folks that you know. So whether that's your coworkers, family members, your neighbor, maybe, we allow now for direct matching to just, at the work site. So it's only people that go to that particular work site. We didn't have that feature before. So we took the time during the pandemic to upgrade so that that's now available. Another change we just recently made, and we were essentially working on getting it populated, is we have an app called Carpool Now, which allows for real-time ride matching. We do have a lot of van pools in the region. We had thousands of van pools before the pandemic hit, and that went down significantly, as you can imagine. And these were 7 to 15 passenger vans that were essentially bringing folks from all over, even outside of the region, into the region. So one of the things that we are introducing, or we just introduced, is called flexible van pooling, and it allows riders, particularly the hybrid workers, if you wanted to go in and take a van pool, it allows you to buy a seat or do same day ticketing onto one of those van pools. And so once we have all the operators on board, you can basically use that app to do that. You can see, where the vans are coming from, and then essentially book your seat and take the trip into your office. Same with online, you're able to do that online on the software system. So recently introduced, we're hoping that's going to help the van pool community. There's no charges for it. Essentially, it's just whatever your fee is, you pay that directly to the van pool operator. So I think those were a couple things. And then the other thing is just right now we're kind of, we've been looking at our messaging, and we're probably going to be looking at making some changes to that to really focus in on these hybrid workers and folks that are, choosing to drive versus using alternative modes. And don't have an answer for that yet, but it's something that we're looking at very closely.
In this area, we are particularly fortunate in terms of transit options. In Montgomery County alone, we are looking at the Purple Line, we are looking at BRT. If this is the best possible, and we can't seem to make it work.
I don't think there's one strategy in particular that's going to essentially be, the silver lining to everything to get folks out of their cars. I think it's just a combination, and you need to have options. And that's why it's important to let people know what those options are, because honestly, in looking at some of the survey data, some people just don't know what their options. For instance, we have over 300 park and ride lots in this region, but a lot of folks don't know about park and ride, and they don't know that there might be a transit connection there. They don't know that you might be able to ride your bike to that transit stop in a safe manner and hop on transit. So a lot of that is really just getting that information out there and making sure that through the employer, through the local jurisdictions, through the media, through marketing, any way that we can do that. That's one of the I think one of the linchpins. There are some setbacks that we've experienced in the region, but I think some of that is going to be in the rearview mirror soon. I think with the return of the 7,000 series rail cars on Metro, there's been a regional bus transformation project that's going to really improve buses in the region. City of Alexandria, there's no bus fare now. That's something pretty big. I think other bus transit agencies might be looking at doing something similar if they're able to do it.
Are you seeing ridership go up in Alexandria as a consequence?
I can't say for sure. I don't have that data in front of me, but I think it could be something that, is going to be more enticing to individuals if you know that you don't have to pay, to ride.
Sometimes even if you make transit free, it's so infrequent and not convenient that it's not valued.
We do collect data. We do have a transit committee here, and there is data that's being collected. I think they have data through September, but I don't have those numbers in front of me. Mm-hmm. But I think it has been on the increase for sure, both for bus and rail, more so than what it was even a year ago. And a lot of it, again, has to do with offices reopening and that type of thing. So there has been an uptick in transit use. Is it where it was pre-pandemic? Absolutely not. We're far from that, but I think we're heading towards that direction. So I think if folks have a sense of comfort in terms of knowing that the buses are clean and safe, or even that the rail line, the rail cars, whether it's commuter rail or Metro, and that maybe their employer is offering some type of a transit benefit. Parking is convenient for them to get to that transit stop, whether it's a park and ride lot or another garage, or even if they could bike to transit. Those are all factors that really kind of help the commuter make their choice. Now, is that going to be right for everybody? No. But there are certain segments of the population where it's going to appeal to them, and I think it's something that would be of benefit because we do want to remove cars from the road. We don't want an increase in cars. And we certainly don't want to go past where we were pre-pandemic with traffic volumes and traffic congestion. It's just not helpful. We only have so much infrastructure, and it's, it can only handle so many, so much volume. So we have to manage it in a way where, folks are given these options and they can make those choices.
Well, yes, of course. I mean, the balance of infrastructure is the issue. So do you think the balance of infrastructure right now is appropriate toward the goals that your office has in promoting commuting?
Well, we do have a long range plan. It goes out to 2045. And I think as part of that plan, all of the things I was just talking about as demand management, transportation demand management, those play a pretty important role in making sure we reach those goals. Are we going to be there? I mean, I think it's going to take effort. I don't think it's us saying, okay, here's what we need to do. I think it's got to be a joint operation amongst all of the stakeholders in the region, including commuters. They need to be part of the equation. And so I think a lot of jurisdictions and transit agencies and others, they're always seeking public input on what works, what doesn't, how can things change, what can be made better. And sometimes we don't have all the answers, but I think for the most part, there's been a tremendous effort, at least, as long as I've been involved in this region of whether it's elected officials, planners, the agencies themselves, our state funding agencies, our transit agencies, they've all really collectively tried to work together to meet those goals. So whether it's congestion reduction or improved air quality, I think everybody's been on the same page in terms of
what goals have been met.
Well, what I said was that they've been meeting goals of setting targets, setting where we
setting targets involves getting to them, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. So you need to get, and as I was saying earlier, collectively, you need to work together to make sure that that's delivered. So what does that require? It requires planning efforts. It requires money. It requires building out, those particular projects in our long range plan and making sure that they're going to be effective.
Nicholas Ramphos, thank you for taking the time to come on I Hate Politics. You clearly are of the view that the pandemic may have been an interruption, but has not changed our lives entirely, and that we will be back.
Absolutely.
Well, I hope you'll come back.
Okay. I'd love to come back. Thanks for having me.
That was Nicholas Ramphos of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments Transportation Planning Board. I'll be back with Jordan Rappaport of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City.
They said a world of wonder, she took only steps but left more than just footprints. Oh, 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 oh. Like fireflies in a mason jar, light that would outshine any starlight that shined on me. Oh, and everyone like succulents on a windowsill breathe life into the air. She'd fill a room with...
Jordan Rappaport, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Great, I'm happy to be here.
You've written a paper that argues that increasing work from home will lead to a faster pace of growth in the ex-urban areas of large metropolitan cities. Can you briefly describe the causal mechanism of your argument?
Sure. Let me just start by saying that, what I'm going to talk about are my views and not those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City or the Federal Reserve System. So the causal mechanism that I'm focused on is, with a shift to hybrid working for a looks like it's going to be a large share of the workforce, that, for example, if you worked home 2 days per week, 2 of the work days, that you're going to end up saving massive amounts of time commuting. And And I can quantify that, just to give you an example, I can quantify that for the Washington, D.C. area. So in Washington, D.C., the typical one-way commute time, if you're living in the outer suburbs to downtown Washington, that's about 87 and a half minutes. So almost an hour and a half. So you can imagine that if you're working home 2 days per week, that's an hour and a half. That's 6 hours per week that you would be saving in commuting. So what happens then in the causal mechanism is that makes you willing, and we have, there's empirical evidence that if you have less time spent commuting, that you're willing to live further away from where you work. And so the idea is that with the hybrid working, people saving time commuting, that they're going to be willing to move further away. And so the implication for housing is that there's a lot of land further away, a lot of undeveloped land, and it's easier, it's also less expensive to build houses further away, both because there are large tracts on which you can build subdivisions, and because there are less zoning regulations, and of course, most importantly, the land itself is less expensive. So essentially, you're opening up all this land for development, and then that should lead to a long-term boom in single-family construction. So that's the mechanism.
I saw recently some writing from MIT scholars modeling the fact that it seems that commute times appear to be the same irrespective of the size of the urban core that is sort of central to your analysis. So if it doesn't make a difference what the length of the commute is, and they are using cell phone data, and I think most of the empirical evidence comes from cell phone data out of China, they are arguing it is immaterial how large a metropolitan area is. The commute tends to be the same for everybody.
Yeah, I disagree. I mean, obviously they're documenting something empirical, but I don't think they're looking at it the right way. It's true that, like, if you look at the median commute time, so the commute time, half the people have a longer and half have shorter, that doesn't vary hugely across metropolitan area. It is in the United States positively correlated with metropolitan size, but it's not nearly as big as if you look at people who are working downtown. Okay. And the ones that have the longest commute downtown, that's where you really see these huge differences. The people who live, the people with the longest commutes to downtown varies hugely across metropolitan areas. I'm looking at commuting data from 2012 to 2016. So like the longest one is New York City. All right. Where 95% of the people have a commute time less than 115 minutes, but 5 have a commute time more than 115 minutes. And then for Washington, it's 87 and a half minutes. Whereas if I look at, I'm going to look at metropolitan areas that have 500,000 people or more, then some of those at the bottom, they have a one-way commute time, again, the 95th percentile to downtown, of about 45 minutes. All right. So you do see a huge correlation the way I'm looking at it.
At the 95 percentile level, those are the numbers. What is it at 75 percentile level?
It's positively correlated. It's just at lower number, at a lower average time than the 95th percentile. The footprint of a metropolitan area, how far it moves out, is garnered, is particularly mediated by commute times, and so that you don't get metropolitan areas growing out forever. Like how far they grow is mediated. If you can pay higher wages in the center, people are willing, in that metropolitan area will expand further away. But in the end, there does seem to be a centripetal force that's keeping you towards the center. And so if you can weaken that centripetal force, I would say that people are tethered to their place of work, but you sort of loosen that tether with hybrid working, and that sort of lets the footprint of the metropolitan area move out.
How do you balance that centripetal force with respect to employment versus that centripetal force with respect to amenity centralization? So, for example, you are saying that the centripetal force of employment is dissipating, is reducing as a consequence of work from home, right? But are you seeing a similar decentralization of amenities as well? Or how are you balancing between those two centralization forces?
So I have focused on work in this particular article, but I think you bring up an important point that there are a lot of amenities that are centralized also. If it's zoos, museums, other civic amenities, entertainment districts. So I do think that that part of this centripetal force that keeps metropolitan footprints from growing even further away is coming from the amenities. It's a good question about how centralized is employment, and something I'm spending a lot of time looking at it. What I can tell you is that, for instance, in some occupations, you see a huge amount of centralization, and no more than in the legal occupation, where in a lot of metropolitan areas, you see 30, 40% of the legal occupation job, very close to the center. And so, what I don't think that hybrid working is going to do is I don't think for these sort of core jobs, I don't think it's going to make them expand further away. I think they're going to stay in the center. In fact, I can see them centralize even more, because if you're commuting less times per week, the impetus for taking some of those jobs and putting them further away. I mean, one thing is to save your workers' commute time, but if they're coming in less frequently, they don't need to save that as much. The benefit for them of the workplace being in the suburbs is going to be less. So I think that those workplaces in the center and a lot of those amenities in the center, I think they'll remain in the center. What it is that it's easier to access them from further away.
People that are going to center city, right, and getting paid highly, and possibly, especially if it's a big lawyer job, then they are likely also to be able to afford more housing closer to the center city. What about that income variation?
The higher your income, the more you're able to afford housing that's closer, the more expensive housing, and housing closer to the center tends to be more expensive. For many of these people working in the center, it's still quite a steep challenge to afford housing. And, another consideration is that higher income people tend to want bigger houses. So, even if they could afford, they still have to cut down on the size of their house by living next to the center. So they too, it's, even if you do have a higher income, you're still very much valuing lower house prices.
I've been thinking, after reading your paper, most of all about the public policy consequences thereof. Jurisdictions such as mine in Montgomery County, or Frederick, or Prince William in Virginia, or Fairfax in Virginia, or thousands of others. They are interested in not just in being bedroom communities, but rather actually attracting employment. The second thing that I'm really, really concerned about is the climate impact of the kind of growth that results from this. There are some structural constraints you consider that you think are immovable. For example, building more density in inner suburbs is difficult, but there are some structural constraints that we have with respect to climate. And how we balance those things is sort of the public policy impact that has concerned me most of all.
Most metropolitan areas in the United States have hundreds of taxing authorities. There's heavily decentralized governments in metropolitan areas. Now, there are advantages of that in the sense that, to the extent you'd like municipal policy to be responsive to citizens and residents, the decentralized, having this local government, is certainly a benefit. But there are costs to that too. There's some big costs. And for one thing, it's just hard to do metropolitan planning, transportation infrastructure, utilities, pollution. And so then you might get municipalities competing for that. The truth is, though, it doesn't necessarily make sense to have this stuff spread out through a metropolitan area. All right. I mean, you want things where they're accessible by a large share of people. That ends up transferring a lot of benefits to the businesses as they sort of play local governments off against each other. But the ideal public policy would be to try to treat that as a metropolitan area resource. What I've kind of argued is that as you move to less frequent commuting, that the benefits to a business of locating in the center are probably going to be higher than they are now. All right. So you still will see these municipalities competing. But I would think, or my hypothesis is it's going to be less successfully than they have been so far. If you leave aside the tax revenue, and I know that that's a really big consideration, I'm not saying you can't, but if you leave that aside, then you certainly have municipalities that specialize in, as a great place to live, not necessarily as a great place to work. That, in my mind, would lead to probably more ideal settlement patterns. So we have a political structure that's going to work against this, but I don't think that, either hybrid working or even pre-hybrid, even now, that's ideal. And maybe that's a segue into the, thinking about the environmental impact here. So, all else equal, it's true that, having shorter commutes, because physically shorter commutes, will lead to, we're thinking about carbon emissions from automobiles, that would tend to cut down. But one thing about this very decentralized structure is everyone needs to take an automobile to get to work. It's hard to do public transit when things are very decentralized because, you need to, there's not like one location where you have to focus your public transit getting to. Whereas if you had more centralized employment, then it's easier to set up a public transit system that ferries people into the center. I don't necessarily think that this is something that's going to hurt the effort to cut down on carbon emissions. There'll be some benefits to it. There's some cost.
In reality, the transit is not what is going to expand first as exurbs grow. What is going to expand first are highways, right? Even in the Washington, D.C. region, right? We do have commuter rail, but also nothing like the Long Island Railroad. I mean, we are nowhere near that kind of frequency or that kind of volume, and certainly we can't even fill our metro right now. As the exurbs grow, as Frederick goes, as Prince William grows, the climate impact is actually horrendous.
Carbon emissions are going to be somewhat proportional to your population. The longer people drive, obviously there'll be more climate impact. I mean, if people are driving in
or have bigger homes. I mean, if that's the issue, that go out and have a big home, heating that home is a disaster to the climate.
No, because you're putting in more efficient heating systems and appliances today than you would have a home that you built 30, 40 years ago. So, but there's no doubt that all else equal, what you say is definitely true. And there's also a benefit to people getting their bigger homes. I mean, people want bigger homes. They want, and it's not, there are these externalities, but, on their individual basis, if you were to say, look,
But as a general matter of welfare, of public general welfare, is that good policy?
There are costs and benefits, and I can't answer on balance. What I can tell you is that there are all these externalities, people generating, people driving, a monster truck on the road and then making putting me at danger because if we were to have a collision, that their mass is so much more than mine. So there are all sorts of externalities. And, if you had a sometimes in economics, we talk about a social planner, like some sort of dictator who said, well, these are all the incentives. This is what you're going to do. And in theory, you could get much better outcomes. In practice, that's unlikely to happen. And so, you design public policies. If you had, really good public policies, they would seek to mitigate these things through, one obvious one, if you think that we're emitting too much carbon.
But the externality of climate impact is so dramatic right now that to ignore it, like we ignore a monster truck and say, oh, I hope I don't get hit by that. And I agree with you. It's terrible. I mean, the size of vehicles are so large, personal vehicles are so large that, they are a menace, to be honest. But that's an externality in the system, and it's not within our capacity to fix all of them. But with respect to climate action, I mean, really, if we don't do it now, if we say that, we allow more exurban growth, that we don't make the hard decisions to increase density near the core, then we've lost the battle. The Earth is gone.
Yeah, well, I like the Earth, so I don't want to lose that battle. And I think most economists would tell you if there's a negative externality, try to internalize that, try to make people pay. So, ideal public policy is if you think that, we all think carbon emissions are bad, but like if, to the extent that, let's say, autos or commuters are a major source of that, right, then the sort of obvious thing is to try to make them face that cost, which you would do by taxing carbon emissions, or you might implement that through a tax on gasoline. There's no doubt that, that, for instance, the restrictive zoning that you see in a lot of in core municipalities or in inner suburbs, that those are not ideal, that, ideal public policy from a broad perspective would be to get rid of that. That's one of the things that's keeping housing so expensive are the restrictive zoning. So these problems, they are really big problems. Again, like you want to make people face these costs. So, the obvious thing here, which would lead to more compact metropolitan areas, is if there are gasoline taxes, but, my understanding is that for the most part, they're not high enough, okay, to capture the externalities. I'm not trying to say those problems are not first order problems, okay, and that in some ways, to the extent that you get the people living further away, that they will contribute to those problems. And I'm not trying to say really if it's a good or bad thing. I'm just trying to say that this is likely to happen. To the extent that there are negative effects of it, then that would call, it probably calls for a public policy response. But, as you're sort of highlighted, it's very hard, in terms of actual feasibility, it's very hard to see that actually happening. And it was very frustrating. I mean, I can see your frustration, and I can tell you as an economist that there's so many things I see out there, or that economists see out there, that we think could be done much better and implemented in a market-friendly way, in a market economy, but they don't happen. And so this is where you start facing political constraints.
DC, the Washington District of Columbia, right, lost about 5% of its population over the pandemic, about 40,000 people. The Mayor Muriel Bowser, who's in the district, has announced a comeback plan, with which she intends to increase the downtown residency by about 15,000. She wants 35,000 more jobs there in the district. And it seems that this is fairly typical of other metropolitan cores as well. Do you think this kind of policy can work?
In terms of the competition with suburban space, I do see some longer term forces that are going to favor the downtown space. DC, I think, has, you have a ton of amenities, from the mall to all the civic institutions. I mean, DC, there was a ton there in the central municipality that I think, give DC, if not necessarily downtown, but the district as a whole, lots of competitive advantages. There's potential for DC to remain a very vibrant place, and possibly addressing some of the affordability crisis for some of the lower income residents. So, I don't see this as all a bad thing. I think in the long term, it can prove a very good thing. But there's no doubt that there are these short-term in the next few years, at least for over the next few years, there are these steep challenges.
Jordan Rappaport, thank you for coming on I Hit Politics. As you do more research, please come back.
I'd be happy. Thank you for inviting me.
Look at them, the way you look at them, like they are red or green or blue or rainbow all over. The way you look at them, like they are from another galaxy. Talk to them, oh, you won't talk to them. They are not your kind, and you can't even communicate. You stay away from them, 'cause they are from another galaxy. Oh, they walk this earth right by your side.
You're listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. What lessons can we draw from my conversations with Jordan Rappaport of the Kansas City Fed and with Nicholas Ramphos of the Metropolitan Washington Transportation Planning Board? First, once the pandemic made work from home acceptable, it has brought significant consequences for how we commute and where and how we live. At least that is the theory. Second, it is really interesting to see how looking at the same evidence can produce different perspectives. At one level, Ramphos and Rappaport disagree. Ramphos sees low transit ridership as a temporary problem and expects a return of people to their offices and therefore to transit ridership. Rappaport argues that work from home is permanently changing our choices about where we live. His prediction that housing growth will occur in the exurbs is much more dramatic and lasting. But scratch a little, and Rappaport accepts that city centers have a long-term advantage, especially places like Washington, D.C., which have great public amenities. How the centrifugal force of work from home will balance with the centripetal force of city center amenities is unclear at this moment. Third, none of the predictions are inevitable. Political leaders in city centers, such as Mayor Bowser of Washington, D.C., will try to come up with policies to reverse the trends, simply to grow their tax base. Perhaps more importantly, allowing the growth of exurbs, allowing the housing market to play out as Rappaport predicts. Unmindful of climate consequences is a human disaster that government leaders will hopefully try to avoid. They have some hard work to do, including reforming dreaded zoning laws to allow higher and denser growth that makes housing more affordable and closer to amenities. But I can't imagine non-intervention once we know this. That's all for this episode. You've been listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from Rockville singer-songwriter Gabriel Zui. They graduated from MCPS in 2018 and now serve as a commissioner on Rockville City Human Rights Commission and on the Montgomery County Committee Against Hate Violence. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please sign up for updates at our website, ihppod.org, or email us at ihppod@gmail.com. I hope you'll subscribe and share the show as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.
Why can't I just be me? Who you are, what defines you? Do we ever come without a label? These days, when we were younger, these things didn't matter anyway. They showed me the corners of the world, said you can go this far in life, you can touch the sky. Well, baby, I can fly. Why just shoot for the stars when I can aim for the galaxies far beyond? So if I can be anything, why can't I just be me? Who you are, what defines you? Ever come without a label? These days, when we were younger, these things didn't matter anyway. When you're telling me that to their expectations,